and good afternoon. Happy Sunday. It's another lovely day here in the Treasure Valley. It has been getting colder in the mornings and at night, but it looks like it's going to be in the 80s for this week, so it looks like autumn is going to have to wait. I'm coming to you here on a Sunday afternoon because I wanted to talk about the Constitution. Yesterday was Constitution Day, but I was unfortunately too busy to get online. I just spent the day with my family, actually. Spent the morning with two of my sons, and we hung out together and did some fun stuff. We took a walk to the German restaurant here in town and tried it out. It was pretty good. Had some bockwurst and seasoned fries. And then yesterday evening, my daughter and I went to a dad and daughter dance hosted by one of our local candidates, and that was a lot of fun as well. So that was my day yesterday. So I'm going to take a few minutes here just to talk about Constitution Day now, a day late. It's called Constitution Day because back in 1787, on September 17th, the Constitution was signed by the members of the Constitutional Convention. After the Revolutionary War, the 13 colonies, which remember, the 13 colonies were not a united country during the war. They were 13 separate bodies, and they had joined together for the purposes of presenting a united front, first in negotiations with the British Crown, and then in the war against Britain. And after the war, they had to figure out what to do. And some of them wanted to be independent. Some of them wanted to have a strong central government. That was a lot of the debates going back and forth. And so they drafted the Articles of Confederation, but they proved inadequate. And so the states, the 13 colonies, sent representatives to Philadelphia. And originally, the idea of the convention was to... Yeah, I just realized I don't have my microphone up here, so you probably haven't heard me. Okay, so originally the idea of the Constitutional Convention was to revise the Articles of Confederation to make them work better. But they came out of it with an entirely new constitution. And September 17th, 1787, they signed it, and they circulated it amongst the state governments. Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Monroe wrote the Federalist Papers, basically editorials in newspapers and broadsheets that were circulated to try and convince people to sign on to the Constitution. And those we still have those documents today, and they're very important for interpreting the Constitution, for understanding the mindset, the context of the founders who wrote it. By September of 1788, a year later, 11 of the 13 states had ratified it, and so it went into effect. And they had the first congressional and presidential elections shortly after that, and George Washington became the president, and the rest was history. And the Constitution really is an amazing document, and I think it is worthwhile to set aside time to honor it and study it. When I taught a homeschool pod a couple of years ago, over the period of several weeks, my students and I read through every word of the Constitution. We went through the articles and then every amendment. And obviously, they're not going to be able to memorize the entire thing, but I wanted them to be familiar with it so that as they grow up, as they start taking part in the discourse of our country, that they would have a foundation for understanding what made the country what it was. You'll see people on both the left and the right talking about the Constitution, but they talk about it in a way that, seminary students talk about the scripture, about the Bible, where they just kind of pull whatever they want out of it. This is constitutional, that's constitutional. You saw that with the Dobbs decision, how the Supreme Court sent the issue of abortion back to the states, overturning Roe v. Wade. And you have leftists saying that they took away a constitutional right. Now, obviously, there's no mention of abortion in the Constitution, but it has almost become this amorphous, vague document that people can pull whatever they want out of it. The Constitution was amazing because it created a unique and new system of government ex nihilo, out of scratch, out of nothing. You had people in some states were wanting a strong, or people, some of the founders wanted a strong central government because they had these issues they needed to deal with. The debts of the colonies, the war debts. How do you manage this country? How do you deal with rebellions? How do you deal with trade and international diplomacy? And this is a new country getting up, getting its start right off the ground. It's basically like, in our modern parlance, it was a startup, and they had to figure things out on the fly. Of course, there were others who said that a strong central government would be a bad thing because it would give them the power to trample on our liberties. And they had just fought a war to protect themselves, to protect their liberties from a tyrannical government in London. They didn't want to trade that tyranny in London for a tyranny here in America. And so they had these vociferous debates about how to structure a government that would be both strong enough to protect this new nation, but also weak enough that they couldn't um, trample on the rights of the citizens. And reading about these debates is really fascinating. They came up with the bicameral legislature, a two-chambered Congress, where the Senate was a fixed number. Every state, no matter how big they are or small they are, had two senators, and they were appointed by the states. And so they represented the interests of the states as sovereign bodies. And then you had the House of Representatives, apportioned by population. So that meant that a populous state like New York at the time, or Pennsylvania, they would have a bit more of a voice in the House than, say, Rhode Island or one of the other smaller states. Having those two chambers and having to have laws passed by both of them really meant that whatever came out of Congress really represented the interests of all Americans. Now, obviously, even slavery was an issue. The Constitution itself doesn't mention slavery by name. It kind of has implications here or there. It talks about how they will be able to ban the slave trade at a certain date in the future. They put it off. They kicked the can down the road. But also with apportionment, how do you handle slaves? People remember the 3/5 clause, and you'll see usually people on the left, black activists will talk about the 3/5 clause, how the original U.S. government only considered black people 3/5 of a person, but it's actually opposite of what people think. It wasn't that the writers of the Constitution were trying to dehumanize black people. It was that they were worried that if the southern states could count their slaves as part of their population, that would give them disproportionately more power. It's the Southerners who wanted to count slaves as citizens when it came to apportioning the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. But the Northerners correctly pointed out that if these slaves couldn't vote, they couldn't take part in the political process, then why should they be counted? And so eventually they came to a compromise where they were counted as 3/5 of a person. And, it has nothing to do with the humanity of, African people. It was just trying to figure out how to have those southern states be represented. And I think we see a similar debate nowadays with illegal immigrants. That I've seen various speculations, various studies trying to figure out how much illegal immigration alters the balance of power in Congress and the Electoral College. Because if you count, say, illegal immigrants in California, of which there are probably millions, that probably gives them more power in Congress and more of a voice in the presidential election than they should have. But anyway, that's a debate for another day. The Constitution itself was great. It created a new system of government that was able to serve the American people and set the stage for several centuries of unprecedented and unparalleled growth. America went from being a handful of colonies in the New World to the greatest nation in the history of the world. And in such a short time, too. It took the Roman Republic centuries to go from being just a city state to being the master of the known world. And it took America 200 years. The Constitution was ratified in 1788. By 1898, just over a century, we had become an imperial power, annexing Hawaii and Cuba and the Philippines, defeating the old Spanish Empire in a war. And just a few decades after that, we are, standing atop the world like a colossus. So the founders were quite wise in what they did, in the way they constructed it. I do not go as far as Glenn Beck did the other day in saying that the words of the Constitution were, written by the hand of God. I don't want to put the Constitution up on the same level as Holy Scripture. It's we're not going to stick the Constitution in our Bibles as the 67th book, or however many the Catholics have. I believe the men who wrote it were, inspired, but I'm not going to say that the Constitution itself is a divinely inspired document, because that opens up all sorts of theological questions. I think when people talk about the genius of the Constitution, what they're really talking about is the Bill of Rights. And remember, the Bill of Rights wasn't part of the Constitution to begin with. It was added just after it was ratified. And the very fact that they could amend the Constitution, that is so important. A lot of constitutions, written constitutions, are made, it comes out and it's finished and that's it. But the founders, the writers of the Constitution, gave us the ability to change it because they knew that times would change. They knew that the people would be different. It's interesting. The word constitution can mean a written or unwritten, framework for a government, but it can also mean the components that make up a body. If you talk about someone has a hardy constitution, that means that they are strong, and their immune system is good, and they're in good shape. And it's the same thing with the U.S. Constitution. It can also refer to the makeup of the United States as a group of people. And the founders knew that group of people would be different from generation to generation, so they gave them the ability to amend the Constitution. And the first 10 amendments, obviously, are the Bill of Rights, which are explicitly designed to limit the powers of the federal government. And people sometimes forget that. People will say that the Constitution grants us rights. No, it protects rights that the founders believed were inherent in our humanity, that we are given these rights by God, or we just hold them naturally because we are human beings. And the Constitution forbids the government from infringing on those rights. It's an important distinction. But that amendment process, was followed up until recently, fairly recently. The last amendment to actually be added to the Constitution, to go through the drafting and ratification process, that is, was 1971. That's more than 50 years ago. I don't think there's ever been such a gap. I'd have to look back at the timeline of amendments. There were some times in the 1800s where they didn't change it much. The 12th Amendment came about just after the election of 1800, and then the 13th Amendment wasn't until slavery was abolished after the Civil War, so that was a big gap as well. But in the time between the Civil War and the 1960s, we amended the Constitution numerous times, and it always followed the same process. Congress drafted the amendment. It was ratified by both houses, and then it was ratified by 2/3 of the states. And that's the way it's supposed to work. That's the way the founders built into the system. And the last time that was actually done that way was the 26th Amendment in 1971. It was during the Vietnam War, and 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds were being drafted and sent off to fight and die in foreign countries. And yet they did not have the right to vote for the leaders who were making those decisions. And so it was entirely reasonable to change the wording of the Constitution to allow 18, 19, and 20-year-olds the right to vote. And so there you go. Of course, the 27th Amendment was ratified in 1992, and that's the one that says that a Congress may not vote itself a pay raise, basically. It says that any change to congressional salary or compensation will take effect with the next Congress. However, that was originally part of the Bill of Rights. That was originally one of the first amendments proposed, but it was never ratified. It was passed by the Congress, but it was not ratified by enough states. But because the amendment had no sunset clause, it stayed out there in the ether for 200 years. Several states would ratify it, and then new states would be added to the Union, which would then increase the threshold for 2/3 majority for ratification. And so it was still out there. I think it was some high school student in the 80s discovered it when doing some research for a project, and they sent it to the news and got some attention to it. Some politicians got behind it, and so the last few states ratified it by 1992, and it became part of the Constitution. Nowadays, ever since I think the 1900s, any new amendment that is passed by the Congress is given a sunset clause, saying that if it does not pass by such and such a date, it is null and void. The Equal Rights Amendment was originally proposed in the 70s, I believe, maybe the 60s. I should have looked it up beforehand. But it was actually passed Congress, but it did not earn ratification by the states in time, and it expired. So my point here is that there is a process that the founders gave us to change the Constitution, but we've not been following it for more than half a century. Instead, we've just been using the judiciary to reinterpret the Constitution according to modern morals. When I was reading up on the history of Roe v. Wade for a video I did a couple months ago when the Dobbs decision came out, it was interesting to read how the justices on the court, in the Warren Court and the Burger Court in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, they actually saw their job as to bring the Constitution into the modern world, to reinterpret it to fit modern morals. And that's how they're able to read a right to contraception with Griswold and then a right to abortion with Roe into the Constitution, because they're interpreting it, again, like seminary students who are trying to take the words of Scripture and apply it to situations that the Scripture was not written to apply to. They're just trying to find an excuse to justify the moral position that they believe that America had come to. That's why we look back at the Warren and Burger courts as being very activist. They were trying to, pull the Constitution into the modern era, whereas the Roberts Court, or the Thomas Court is really what it should be called, is looking back and trying to apply the words of the Constitution as they were written. A strict constructionist viewpoint, to actually let the Constitution say what it meant to say and leave everything else to the states, which is how the founders intended it. But whether or not we should interpret the Constitution according to the intent of the founders, that's actually a debate that people have. It's like in literature where you have what's called death of the author. The author might mean his work to be something, but once it's out there, a lot of people believe that you can then take it and apply it in different ways, even if it goes contrary to what the author intended. And it's like making Lord of the Rings an allegory for this or that, even though J.R.R. Tolkien did not mean it to be an allegory. So in the 50 years since that last amendment was added, federal judges have been reinterpreting the Constitution to change its wording in all sorts of ways. I mentioned Griswold and Roe. There's also the Kelo decision about 20 years ago that said that eminent domain meant that local governments could seize your property if they thought that they could sell it to somebody who will develop it for, and give them more taxes, basically. A more productive use of the property. I'm not sure the founders intended that. Obergefell in 2015, imposing gay marriage on the entire country. Founders clearly would not have supported that, but the Roberts Court, did a little bit of activism themselves in reading, gay marriage into the words of the Constitution. And that's not, having federal judges reinterpret the words was not how the document was meant to be used. But that is how we use it today. And at this point, we have to ask, even looking at the Bill of Rights, how many of the rights that it's supposed to protect have not already been violated by our government? The First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of religion, we see those trampled all the time. The COVID pandemic gave local and state and even the federal government excuses to do things that were directly contrary to the Constitution. But apparently there's a hidden clause in there that nobody knew about that says if they declare a public health emergency, then all bets are off. Second Amendment, we see gun restrictions everywhere. That's actually one area where the conservatives have won a lot of victories with constitutional carry in a lot of states. The McDonald decision, the Heller decision, that establishes that, yes, the Second Amendment does apply to people. You'll see the left try and twist the words to say that the Second Amendment only applies to the military because they mentioned the militia. I don't think the Third Amendment's been violated, has it? That's the one that prohibits the government from quartering troops in your house. I don't know, maybe you can find instances of that. Fourth Amendment, search and seizure. That's obviously been completely trampled over. The government can surveil you, can seize your stuff, can throw you in prison without bail if they think you're an enemy to their regime. Same thing with Fifth and Sixth Amendments. So anyway, my point is, when we look back at the Constitution, a lot of conservatives, a lot of Republicans will say that we just need to get back to the Constitution. And unfortunately, my response to that is that I think it's pointless to appeal to the Constitution to save us from a situation that the Constitution did not prevent. So we have a situation where we see our rights are being violated, where the government's not following the Constitution. I mean, the biggest example of that might be the 2020 election. People say that the election was stolen. People say that it was illegitimate, but the Constitution was followed. The Constitution does not specify how states are supposed to conduct their elections. It does not specify exactly how the electors should be chosen. Now, most states choose, or all the states really, choose electors based on the vote of the people. There are two states, Maine and Nebraska, that apportion the electors proportionally, whereas every other state is, winner takes all. If you win California by 50% plus one vote, you get all 50 odd electors. But those are state laws. There's nothing in the U.S. Constitution that says it has to be that way. In the early years, prior, in the late 1700s, early 1800s, state governments or even state governors would sometimes just appoint electors and say, okay, vote for the guy we like, or vote or use your conscience, vote for who you think is the best choice. And it wasn't until the 1820s, when Andrew Jackson was elected, that they started actually having the people vote. And of course, back then it was just, land-owning white males. Then it became just white men. Then it became white men and black men. Then it became white men, white women, black women. I think Native Americans were the first group to finally be added to be allowed to vote. But again, that's a state thing. There's nothing in the Constitution that specifies exactly how that should be done. So when the state legislatures gathered after the 2020 election and certified the electoral votes, that was all done according to the Constitution. And when those electors cast their votes and Vice President Pence counted them on January 6th, that was according to the Constitution. So the problem that arose in 2020 was not due to us not following the Constitution. There were other issues at hand. The Zuckerberg bucks, the drop-offs, the ballot harvesting, the mail-in voting, lack of signature verification. All those things are not addressed in the Constitution. And so that really brings me to the heart of what I'm aiming at with this rambling talk. And I appreciate you for listening. Hope it's edifying or educational or at least thought-provoking, even if you disagree. And that is that our country has reached a point where the Constitution does not have an answer for our current crisis. And it's happened before. Curtis Yarvin, the Mencius Moldbug, he's a political philosopher. He has a concept where he calls the Caesar. Obviously, Julius Caesar was a Roman leader who amassed tremendous personal power, but he did it within the system of the Roman Republic. He didn't just come in with an army on day one and conquer. I mean, he did do that eventually. But he amassed tremendous personal power by working through the existing political systems of the Roman Republic. And that's, in fact, why he ended up facing civil war, because Pompey, his one-time ally and now rival, and the Senate realized that he had amassed too much power, and they were going to try and stop him. They were going to use the mechanisms of the government to basically destroy him. And that's why he crossed the Rubicon with his army and started the Civil War and ended up in charge. So Curtis Yarvin has this idea of what a Caesar is. It's somebody who amasses power in a republican system, in a constitutional system, and then takes that power and invests it in himself or bequeaths it to a successor. Caesar, even though he was assassinated, he had all that power that he had amassed. It went to his successor, Augustus, and the Republic was gone. It still existed in name. The Roman Senate still met for centuries afterward, but they did not have the power they once had. Consuls, instead of being elected by the senatorial class, they were appointed by the emperor. And Augustus, he never actually took the title emperor, by the way. Because he had an interest in pretending that the existing system was still functioning. He appointed consuls, and they nominally ran the city, ran the republic, but real power was in the one man. The movie Gladiator takes place at the end of the second century, excuse me. And in the movie, after Maximus kills Commodus, spoiler alert, he says that his wish is for the Republic to be restored. In real life, that never happened because the Republic was a distant memory by then. Nobody knew how to run a republic in the way it was before Caesar had come along. And so what Caesar did is he took advantage of a crisis and assumed tremendous power in himself, and he forever altered his country. There's other examples of this. Napoleon Bonaparte assumed power through a system that had come about after the French Revolution, the Directory. He eventually became first consul of this Directory. And so he became the leader of France through a constitutional republican system. And only then did he then take all that power to himself and name himself emperor. Unfortunately for him, that system did not last, and the rest of Europe allied against him and destroyed him. Another example, Adolf Hitler. He came to power through a constitutional system. He was elected. He was the leader of the party with the most votes, most representatives in the Reichstag, which was the governing body of the Weimar Republic. He was appointed chancellor by the president as according to their rules. But then once in office, he started consolidating power. And within just a few years, he was an autocratic ruler, a dictator. He had taken all the power in the Republican system, in the Weimar Republic, and consolidated it in himself. And of course, he did not last long either. Like Napoleon, the rest of the world allied to destroy him. And as they should, of course. He was a bad guy. However, and this is where Yarvin gets really interesting, this Caesar archetype has appeared in American history too. Let's look at the first one, Abraham Lincoln. Now, you might say, what? You're comparing Lincoln to Caesar and Napoleon and Hitler? Sort of. Lincoln was elected president according to the system of government in America. He was duly elected. His predecessor, James Buchanan, is often looked at as a very weak and bad president because he sat by and did nothing while the Civil War started. The southern states, the moment Lincoln was elected in November of 1860, they started seceding. And Buchanan was still president until March of the next year. So during that time, Buchanan did nothing to stop the secession of the southern states. And people criticize him for that. But his argument was that the Constitution, even though it did not allow for secession, it did not give him the power to stop the southern states from leaving. And I think that's an important distinction. Buchanan wanted to follow the Constitution even to the detriment of the country. Lincoln came in and said that preserving the Union was more important than the letter of the law. And so he did what he thought was necessary to preserve the Union. And he's remembered as one of our greatest presidents. Lincoln called up volunteers in the military, even though he didn't really have that authority. Lincoln waged war without authority. For a while, he was doing it without Congress. Eventually, he called Congress back. He imprisoned people for being against him and against the war. He basically used, his authority to go well beyond the bounds of what we think our government should do. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus in Maryland. But again, we remember him as one of our greatest presidents. Because Even though we don't like to admit it, a lot of times the ends justify the means. We remember Lincoln not as a tyrant who ran roughshod over the Constitution. I mean, Southerners remember him that way. We remember him as the man who did what was necessary to preserve the Union. But in his wake, America was forever changed. The idea of secession, which always was there in the background in the first 100 years of our nation, was now gone. That was declared to be completely out of bounds. The idea of America as a union of sovereign states, that was not really there anymore either. America was now considered to be a single country. It's been said that before the Civil War, people would say these United States. Well, after the Civil War, people say the United States. By going through that crucible of war, America became a stronger and more united country. But in doing so, it lost some of the character that it had had since its founding. The second American leader that Yarvin describes as a Caesar was Franklin Roosevelt. Once again, Franklin Roosevelt was elected as part of the natural process. He won the election of 1932 against Herbert Hoover on the backdrop of the Great Depression. And in his inaugural address, he essentially demanded that Congress give him expanded authority to combat the Depression. He said that he needed the same authority that he would have if America were at war, because he was at war with the Depression. And so he grabbed this authority, this expanded power, and he used it. Unlike people like Hitler or Napoleon, who invested and consolidated power in himself, FDR consolidated it into the federal bureaucracy. What we consider to be the deep state was essentially born in the New Deal. FDR took on additional authorities and powers, and he bequeathed them to the federal bureaucracy. The executive branch grew and grew and grew, and it grew more powerful, and it's never stopped growing. Because once we decided as a nation that it was, the government has the ability and the authority to manage our economy, to make sure that people are taken care of, there's no stopping that. So under FDR, the executive branch grew, and it's never stopped growing. And that was really the beginning of the transformation of our government into what we see today. The Constitution never granted the president the right to set grain prices, or to tell farmers they have to stop growing things, or to work with big business to implement certain regulations that keep out their competition. But FDR's government did all these things. Originally, the Supreme Court actually started striking them down, saying, hey, this isn't constitutional. And what did FDR do? Did he back away and say, oh, well, sorry, my bad? No. He said, okay, well, I'm going to have the Democrat Congress expand the court, and I will pack it, and then I will get my way. They ended up not doing that. They backed away from that, but it was enough to scare the court. And he did appoint several more. He did appoint some replacements, and they started upholding his New Deal, which shows that the Supreme Court is not perfect. And if we don't have a perfect court to protect our Constitution, then, well, what do we do? The other thing about FDR, of course, that everybody knows is he served 4 terms, or he was elected to 4 terms. He died very shortly at the beginning of his 4th. And that was unprecedented in American life. Our first president, George Washington, he served 2 terms and could have won a 3rd. However, had he died in office during his 3rd term, I think it would have established the precedent that the office of president was for life. But instead, he stepped down after 2 terms, and every president after that followed that precedent. Andrew Jackson probably could have won again in 1836, but he stepped down and allowed his vice president to be his successor. Ulysses Grant actually considered running for a 3rd term, but ended up not doing it. Woodrow Wilson thought about running for a 3rd term, but he'd had a stroke and was a mess at that point. FDR, though, by 1940, even though the U.S. was not at war yet, everybody could see that war was on the horizon, and he said we shouldn't change horses in midstream. He appointed himself as the indispensable man in American politics, saying that he alone Out of all the millions of American people, he was the only one who could lead our country during these crises. That's what dictators say. I always like to point out the poetry of the fact that you had two leaders of two great powers come into office in spring or winter spring of 1933. Both men took advantage of a major depression to gain political power. Both men assumed greater powers than their constitutions allowed. Both men would, serve for unprecedented lengths of time, and both men would die, or both men would, engage each other in a war, and then both men would die just before the end of that war. It's really amazing how the careers of Adolf Hitler and Franklin Roosevelt mirror each other. Now, obviously, FDR was not, evil like Hitler. I think he was Machiavellian. I think he was very clever, and I think he did alter our country. The federal bureaucracy, ever since the New Deal, has had so much power over our daily lives that our founders never intended, and the Constitution couldn't stop it. And it's become so entrenched. I mean, nobody is alive who remembers a time before the New Deal. Obviously, there were people who were born in the 1920s, but they were just children when FDR came to power. And so there's not much will to go back and fix it. You had Republicans in the 1960s who were talking about rolling back the New Deal, but they never got anywhere. And then you had Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, which just built on top of it. By the 1980s, with President Reagan, you had people talking about removing this department or rolling back this federal program, but it really didn't happen. Government always expands. It very rarely contracts of its own accord. And so how did the Constitution prevent that? It didn't. So simply saying all we have to do is go back to the Constitution, it's, I think, naive. So looking at the pattern of American Caesars, what do? They arise during a constitutional crisis, an event that is so unprecedented that the Constitution has no answer for it. The Constitution had no answer to secession. So Lincoln just went around the Constitution and fought the Civil War to maintain the Union. The Constitution had no answer for crises so intense as the Great Depression and then World War II. So FDR just did what he wanted and worried about the consequences later. We've reached another point where we have a constitutional crisis. The Constitution has no answer for the way that the Democrats fortified the 2020 election. The Constitution has no answer for the ways in which leaders are using public health crises, whether it's COVID or now they're saying guns or racism or climate change. They use these so-called public health crises to do whatever they want, to restrict our liberties. And the Constitution is not stopping them. You can imagine if you've ever been to a high school football game. At my school, they used to, at halftime, the cheerleaders and a bunch of people would go out and hold a big banner, a big paper banner saying, stomp the opponents or whatever. And the team would come back from the locker room and they would run through the banner and just break it open. That's what our bureaucracy is doing to our Constitution. It's a piece of paper that's being held up and they're just bursting through it. It's not stopping them. Constitutions are just papers. They're just words. If people stop believing in it, if people stop agreeing on the ground rules of our government, then it actually can't stop them. The only thing that stops tyranny is power. And Republicans have been afraid to use their power. Republican leaders, I think they use the Constitution as a shield to prevent them from having to make hard decisions or take controversial stances. Republican leaders will say, well, I like this idea, I like this law, but my attorney general said that it's not constitutional, so I'm not going to support it. I'm going to veto it. I've seen that happen here in our state. Meanwhile, what do the Democrats do? They say, hey, screw the Constitution. We don't care. We're going to do what we want. Sometimes judges strike them down. Other times they don't. I remember when President Bush, George W. Bush, was president, Congress passed the McCain-Feingold Act. It was about regulating campaign finances. And it said that you couldn't spend money on certain issues within this many days to an election. It gave the government broad powers over regulating what people could say during political campaigns and how they could spend their money. And at the time, a lot of Republicans were saying, wait a second, this is completely unconstitutional. The Constitution says we shall, the freedom of speech shall not be regulated, but here we are passing all these laws regulating speech. And so what does President Bush do? He signs it, but he uses a signing statement to indicate his opinion on it, saying that he thinks that this part and this part and this part are going to be struck down by the Supreme Court. Well, surprised Pikachu face, the Supreme Court didn't strike it down, and now it's the law. So what are we supposed to do with that? We need leaders who recognize that the Constitution is not a suicide pact. We cannot let the words of the Constitution or the paper of the Constitution prevent us from doing what's necessary to safeguard our liberties. Because remember, we have to remember what the purpose of the Constitution was. Like I said, it's not divinely inspired. It's not Holy Scripture. It is a document that was created for a purpose. The purpose was to create a government that had the ability to protect the people's life, liberty, and property. That's all it is. And it worked well for a long time. But if we get to the point where it's not working, then we need to find something else. Now, I know a lot of people here that this is where people are going to say an Article 5 Convention of States. And this is where, the Constitution, when the founders wrote the Constitution, they created the amendment process. And there are two ways for an amendment to be made. You can either have Congress propose and ratify an amendment, and then it goes to the states for ratification. Or you can bring together representatives of the states and propose amendments themselves, and then they bypass Congress and go straight to the states. We've amended the Constitution 27 times the first way, starting in Congress. A convention of states has never been done. And so that's the first strike against it. Not saying that makes it a bad idea, but it makes it unprecedented and unpredictable. But it is possible. If you get enough states, they can call for a constitutional convention, send representatives to this convention, at which point they can propose amendments, and if they're ratified by the states, they immediately become part of the Constitution. There's a couple issues with it. I feel like the idea of the Article 5 Convention it seems to me a last-ditch Hail Mary pass. Your football team is down. It's near the end of the game. You have no more plays left in the playbook, but you just want to win the game, so you just heave it downfield. It almost never works. Once in a while, it works. But I don't think this one has a chance of working, because I think the people who support it I believe they are good-natured. I believe they genuinely want to save our country, but they're trying to save it in one fell swoop. I often see the Convention of States sold as this will fix all our problems. And I don't see that. I see people proposing amendments that the convention could then bring up, such as term limits or balanced budget, or an amendment to say that everything has to be constitutional, which seems repetitive to me. But I think people are looking, they realize our country is not in a good place. They realize it's gone downhill from where it's supposed to be, and they're looking for a panacea, one decisive action that is going to solve all our problems and put us back on the right course. And my response to that is, if we have gotten into this situation because courts and politicians and governments are ignoring the Constitution, how does adding more amendments fix that? How are we going to fix the problems by adding to this document that people are already ignoring? And so that's really my perspective on it. I think it's an interesting idea, but I'm not sure it's all it's cracked up to be. And so spending a lot of time and money and resources and energy on that could possibly be better used elsewhere. There's also the fear of a runaway convention. Let's say we send some people to a convention, we call it, it's going, and we send them there to propose a term limits amendment, for example. Fine. But what if they start coming up with other amendments? Remember, the people who make up this convention, this hypothetical convention, are the same people we see in power now, the same political leaders. And the Democrats would have a say too. So not only would we have to deal with the crazy Democrat ideas, we could get the Equal Rights Amendment back, or they could, propose a carbon tax, or they could ban guns, they could repeal the Second Amendment. We would also have to deal with the establishment Republicans who are probably want to come away with that with some sort of compromise. So the idea of a hardline conservative amendment, I think that's wishful thinking. And now the response to that I've heard from proponents is that a runaway convention could be curtailed because the state legislatures, when they pass their resolutions calling for the convention, restrict it to only specific amendments or specific subjects. That's great in theory, but recall that the original Constitutional Convention was not called to write a constitution. They were called to Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. And they decided, you know what? Let's just scrap the articles and write something new. And they did, and it worked. Once a convention is in process, it is very difficult to curtail it. It could get very unpredictable. And that is actually, going back to Glenn Beck, what he said the other day on his radio show. He said that being that we are no longer the people we were, the moral and religious people that John Adams mentions that the Constitution was made for, it is dangerous to bring us together in a place where we can start picking apart the Constitution. And I generally agree with that. We are not the people we once were. Adams said that it would serve no other than the moral and religious people that we were in 1787. And that's true. We are a very different people today. Had the Constitution been written in 1787 by people of a different time, if it was a bunch of Englishmen from the year 1100 or 1215 when Magna Carta was written, or if it was people from Japan or Somalia or China or Austria, just pick a country, not being xenophobic here, just different people have different ideas about how society should be run. They have different concepts of what rights should be protected. Some cultures prize unity more than liberty. Some cultures want, a strong government to be able to direct the people toward what they perceive as greatness, while others are more libertarian or even anarchist. Different people have different ideas. And if we bring together a group of people now, it's going to be very different from the people who wrote the Constitution in the first place. And who knows what they'll come up with. And really, that is the legacy of our Constitution. It was written for a specific people at a specific time, and it served us well for so long, but now we are a different people. What does that mean? I don't know. I'm not calling to scrap the Constitution. I mean, getting back to the Constitution is a fantastic idea, but I don't think it's the panacea that's going to solve all our problems either. So I don't know. I don't really have a definitive conclusion here to say this is what we must do. I think we do need people in power who are more creative, who are willing to do things that maybe don't seem constitutional. You look at what Governor Ron DeSantis is doing in Florida, using the existing power that he has as governor and as the state government of Florida to curtail a lot of the wokeness and nonsense that is being done against our culture. I think President Trump had a lot more options than he knew. He was surrounded by people who opposed his agenda, and so he didn't get the wall finished. He didn't ban birthright citizenship. People use the 14th Amendment to justify saying that anyone who's born on American soil is an American citizen, even if they're a tourist from China or an illegal migrant from Mexico or Guatemala. It's absurd. The people who wrote the 14th Amendment, they did it to ensure that former black slaves would be American citizens. And they specifically knew, they never intended, for example, for a foreign student or, say, a diplomat. Say you have the ambassador from Britain is living in Washington, D.C. at the embassy, and he brings his family and they have a child. That child's not an American citizen. It was never meant to be. But the people have twisted and perverted the words of the 14th Amendment to justify giving citizenship away like it's candy. And so that needs to be done away with. I think President Trump had the ability to do something about it, but he was surrounded by people who said, oh, no, we'd better not do that. That might not be constitutional. And he was surrounded by courts who undermined him at every turn, too, when he tried to undo Obama's DACA executive order. So I think Trump has the right idea. I think he needs to be surrounded by people who will encourage him to go further rather than try and restrain him. Eventually, we're going to get that. If you look back at American history, look back at the cycles of history, say whether it's like the Strauss and House fourth turning theory, that every 4 generations we have a social upheaval. If you look back at that, the founding of America was a fourth turning. The Civil War was a fourth turning. The Depression and World War II was a fourth turning. And what happened in each of those times? The leading men of those societies came together and completely reorganized society. We turned 13 separate colonies into a new nation. At the next one, Abraham Lincoln went beyond the Constitution in order to save the Union. The next cycle, FDR runs roughshod over the Constitution, creating, tremendous power in the federal bureaucracy because he had to deal with the Great Depression and World War II. All of these men achieved greatness and achieved immortality in our cultural memory by going above the words of the Constitution. They are remembered because they did not let that document stop them from doing what they believed was necessary to save our country. Well, it is now a fourth turning. We are in that same cycle. We are due for a Caesar to come in and cut through the red tape, do what's necessary to protect the people, and our country will be different going forward. The only question is it going to be a left-wing Caesar or a right-wing Caesar? Are we going to get a Chairman Mao-style dictator who comes in and just completely ignores the Constitution and its protections of our personal liberties, turns us into a CCP-style dictatorship, totalitarianism? Or is it going to be some sort of right-wing figure, a Trumpian figure, who comes in and restores our liberties, even at the cost of some of the words of the Constitution and established precedent? I don't know, but something's going to happen. History tells us so. And so I think we need Republican leaders who are bold, who are willing to do what is necessary to help people. Because, as I said, the Constitution is not a suicide pact. We don't have to allow ourselves to be destroyed as a culture, as a nation, because we think that's what the words of the Constitution say. So I think that's about all I wanted to say. I just wanted to commemorate Constitution Day. And I think it's important to remember that our goal should not be the words on the paper, but the ideals for which that paper was written. So think about that. I hope I've given you something to chew on. And I will see you again soon. Take care. God bless.